Chapter 1 of the Chess Goals Sicilian Dragon course, we are going to look at the Dubov decline variation. So we're starting off with the open Sicilian, and once you see d4, this is when you know, okay, this is called open Sicilian. Usually more aggressive players play this. We take, they take, we go knight f6, hitting the pawn, and after knight c3, we're playing d6. And this is sort of a classical Sicilian, so how are we going to turn this into what we're calling the Dubov's dragon?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a weird move order because usually people that want to play the dragon start with g6. So this is a little twist. But yeah, after bishop to g5, which is the main move, and the most critical one by far, we play g6. So g6 is a very strange looking move. Seems a little counterintuitive when people first see it. It's very rare. There's not a lot of games in the club database in this. But the idea of g6 is that we're going to allow him to trade because we're going to take back on f6 with the pawn. But in this chapter, we're going to look at other options for white. So, for example, we're going to start with queen d2. We'll also look at bishop c4, bishop e5, any f-pawn moves, and also knight takes c6. So we got a lot of different options here for white, but we're going to start with queen to d2.
So queen d2 is the most common move. You line the queen up with this bishop, looking at bishop to h6 later potentially, trying to trade off for this fianchettoed bishop. And white often wants to queenside castle, so we got to be ready for white to play aggressive. We're recommending bishop g7, reinforcing this knight, preparing to castle. Queenside castle by white is the most common move, and we will circle back and look at a couple options if this knight were to take on c6 or retreat. And now we're going to play knight takes d4. So usually in the dragon, white wants that bishop on e3 to take back on d4. But since that bishop's out on g5 and we started with this classical dragon setup, black has already equalized in this position. So we're giving you guys an equal position according to the engine, and we have really good winning chances because there's opposite side castling. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, right? We get those winning chances, which is the whole point of this course, but we're not sacrificing any engine eval here.
Yeah, knight takes d4 is already very, very strong. And white has to really meet it with queen takes d4, right? And now we just castle. So we've kind of distracted the queen from the diagonal that they want to be on so they can play bishop h6 and have their fun on the king side. And now white usually just goes back to d2. So it's also important to mention if white plays e5, this kind of looks scary because they have this pin on the d pawn, but we have this really cool move, just queen to a5. And what this does, we leave our knight unprotected, but we're creating a pin of our own. We're getting out of this pin and we're creating a pin on this e-pawn, like horizontal pin. You don't see that too often. Where if this pawn moves or takes on d6 or f6, say they take on f6, now we're ready to play queen takes g5 and then take back on f6. So there's nothing to worry about with e5 here, and that's actually a cool little trap that we can get. So anyway, what usually goes queen to d2 instead.
So queen d2 sort of renews this threat, putting the bishop on h6. And we're going to play bishop to e6 here. And what you'll notice is both of these bishops do a great job pointing to the white queen side where the king is sitting on c1. After bishop to h6, now we're going to take the bishop. So this seems counterintuitive at first, right? Why are we taking the bishop and opening up our king, allowing this queen to sink right into h6? But what's going to happen is our attack comes faster. So we're drawing that queen away from the white king. And here we're playing rook c8. And we already have this common idea. Exchange sacrifice, rook takes c3. And after the pawn takes back, we blow open this king side, or this king position by white. And these are really fun attacking positions. So we'll look at here rook to d3, defending the knight, and pawn to f3. So what do you want to start with?
Let's start with pawn to f3. So this move makes a good amount of sense. white is just trying to protect this pawn. So if we play rook takes c3, pawn takes c3, we can't follow it up with knight takes e4. So they're just trying to solidify their center and their position, but we don't care. We go for it anyway. We sacrifice the rook, and white takes back, and their king position is just wide open, and all of our pieces are very, very happy. This a2 pawn is a clear target, but we don't have to take it right away. So we play queen to a5, and now we're targeting these pawns, potentially threatening to take on c3. So here, white usually brings the queen back. So this is kind of how we like, white hasn't started their attack. White has just moved their queen around. They moved it to d4, to d2, to h6, and now they're going to go back because they need to defend. So we've gained a lot of time with their queen moves, and that's allowed our attack to gain more power. And so white has to play queen to e3. So if queen to d2, what would happen, Matt?
I think there's a checkmate here. I'm looking at queen to a3 check. The king moves over to b1, and then we get this little mate in 2, take on a2, and checkmate. And you are definitely going to see that at the club level, and that's a 17 move victory. I see Justin's got a big smile on his face. I cannot wait to see the first person to post that in the Discord server and say, here was my mate in 17. So queen e3. Now we play the other rook to c8, and look at how we're starting to bring all of our pieces into the attack. We already have the bishop, the queen over there. Now the rook's ready to attack, and we're not really in any rush to take that pawn on a2. So that's a good takeaway for you guys. Don't just grab that pawn right away. Build up as big of an attack as you can. Add up the pressure, and sometimes here you're even fine going into an endgame. So let's look at king d2, most common move. And how do we break through here? How do we continue the attack with this king that looks like he's sort of getting to safety on d2?
Yeah, if we aren't urgent here, white can kind of solidify everything and get his pieces out, and they'll have an okay position. So here, it's very, very important. Anytime the king is in the center, what do we want to do? We want to break open the center. So we play d5, a very, very strong move, ready to blast open the center with pawn takes d5, open up this d file, and have just unlimited like access to that king. Taking on e4 also weakens this e4 square, so the knight can finally hop into this attack. It's just a very, very strong move. So white usually wants to keep everything nice and closed, so they play e5, and then we still want to break things open. So how do we break things open, Matt?
We play pawn to d4. And this attacks the queen and attacks the pawn on c3 that's already being attacked by our queen and rook. And I think this move definitely deserves an exclam, or maybe a double exclam. Queen takes d4. Best move for white, actually. This is the top engine move, and it walks right into rook to d8. So in the end, we're going to be up material. So the queen is going to trade for the rook. White is currently +3, but that's a gain of 4. 9 versus 5. So we'll be +1 on material. This king is going to be wide open, and the eval is -7. So our plan is going to be take the queen, move this knight, and then start attacking white's weak pawns, right? They have the doubled weak c pawns. They have the a pawn that's isolated. This pawn on e5 is going to become a weakness. And I think this is going to be a very easy conversion for us at a -7 eval.
Yeah, it's crazy how quickly it can spiral for white. Because after d4, like queen takes d4 is the only move. Like it's the top computer move. It's just crazy how strong this attack is. So let's backtrack, and in this position, instead of looking at f3, we're gonna look at rook d3. So this move isn't super common, but we wanted to look at a different idea of how white could try to stop us from sacrificing on c3. Because if they do pretty much anything else besides protect that knight, we're just going to take on c3. So in this line, white is trying to stop this. So we had to go for a little bit of a different attacking idea. And right away, again, because it's opposite sides castling, we're willing to sacrifice material to open up lines. So we play b5. And this is a very, very key move. We're more than happy to sacrifice this pawn on b5 to open up these lines. So for example, knight takes b5, they accept the sacrifice, and now we bring our queen in with queen to b6. We're hitting f2 and potentially putting pressure on b2 once this knight moves. So queen b6 is very strong. The white knight goes back to d4 and blocks us from taking this f2 pawn. And now we just take this opportunity to snag a free pawn, because here he's attacking our bishop. We don't really want to lose that bishop, so we just take on a2. We move the bishop out of the way and snag a free pawn in the process.
And the eval here is already -2.5 or -3, so we have a big advantage. Most players here will try to trap the bishop. So usually when you see a bishop grab a pawn on a2 like this, pawn to b3 is the thematic response, attempting to trap the bishop. But we have a really strong move here. Bishop takes b3. And the problem is this pawn on c2 is pinned by our rook. This rook is trying to defend the knight. So what does white play? Knight takes b3, right? It looks like white's holding everything. They're +2 in terms of material. And now we have this another very strong move, knight to g4, attacking the queen, attacking c2, which forks both rooks. So how is white going to hold everything? Well, they need the queen to try to defend the pawn on f2. Queen to h4. But now we can still play knight takes f2. Our queen defends it. We have the fork of the rooks. So let's just go a little bit deeper. We'll show kind of the most common moves in the database. Rook to f3, trying to keep control of that f2 square to trap our knight. Knight takes h1. And now after rook h3, going for checkmate, we can play pawn to h5, and we're just shutting this all down. So we're 20 moves in. We already have a -5 or -6 stockfish advantage. Do you want to go a few moves deeper in this line, or do you think that's good?
Yeah, I want to go a little bit deeper just to show how we can defend here, because a lot of white has a lot of practical chances here. They have a pretty strong attack. They got a lot of pieces around our king. So it's important to know how to defend here and know that everything's going to be okay as long as you play the right defensive ideas. So white tries to break through, open this h file with g4. So we cannot take this pawn without giving up checkmate. So what do? We play queen to g1. So we just let him take this pawn on h5. It's a free pawn, but we're going to win their bishop. And it's with check. So after king to b2, we've kind of run out of checks, but we have an attack of our own, right? The white's attacking us, and we're attacking white. So white tries to open things up with h6, g6 in the future, but we can create our own attack with queen to g2. So now after h6, g6, we're lining up on the c2 pawn, and we're ready to break through with rook takes c2. And this is actually forced mate in 7 for us. Yeah, and once the king moves, rook to a2 checks coming. Just a series of checks. The rook over here is coming in, and it's going to be mate in the near future. So we wanted to show how this attack for white just really stalls, and because they're playing so much on our king side, it allows us to just really break through on the queen side.
And what I like about that line too is we showed one way to counterattack white's king, but there were actually a lot of options on most of those moves as long as you kind of keep an eye on either slowing down white's attack or creating threats on our end. So now we looked at 8 queenside castle. Let's look at knight takes c6. So like Justin mentioned, very common that you'll see these types of captures at the club level. And I think the reason for that is it just simplifies things a little bit from white's perspective. Sometimes they might think, well, that knight could be won via tactics with both our knight and bishop hitting d4. So we're going to take back with pawn, bishop h6. And our rule of thumb here is when they put the bishop on h6, we tend to capture that bishop to deflect the queen away. And then we go for our play on the queen side. So notice how our queen is already hitting b2. This is super annoying. And what do we do if they play a move like rook to b1? Let's just say defending the b pawn. Looks natural.
Yeah, rook to b1 seems like a logical move, but this queen b6 idea is not only threatening b2, it's threatening f2. Even though we don't have anything supporting it, we can take on f2 and give up our queen because we have this nasty knight fork winning
Ooh.
back the queen. We're going to be up a pawn and just much better. The evals are on -2 here. So we have this little trap in our back pocket. So usually white tries to protect and get their king out of the way with castles. So b2 is now protected, and they're not too worried about queen 6 f2 because that would bring our queen further away from our attack. So we don't want to take on f2. We want to keep the pressure and keep our attack going. So we play rook to b8, immediately threatening queen takes b2 check. And now we're going to look at if white tries to stop us from taking on b2 and playing b3 themselves. So now what do we do?
So I like how you took that move to play rook b8 to provoke b3, because now we can grab the pawn. And I should mention, if you grab the pawn on the last move, it's still a very good position for black, but this is just a little bit better. So here we take the pawn. We're looking at an eval of -3. So Stockfish is saying we're up the equivalent of a piece, even though we're only up one pawn. And in this position, what we're going to do is centralize our queen. So we're likely to bring it back to, for example, c5, where we can start to target these other squares. And our plan is pretty straightforward. It's attack white's weak kingside and improve our pieces. So I'm thinking I'd bring this bishop out to g4, maybe out to e6. You don't need to castle. That's the beauty of this position, because white's pieces are having trouble getting into the game. They're not doing a lot to attack our king, but we have pieces already attacking black's king, or white's king, excuse me, and we're up material.
Yeah, we're ready to kind of break through it. And again, this rook b8 move is key because it weakens all the dark squares around their king, and they don't have a dark square bishop. We traded it on h6 at the beginning of this line. So this can be a very annoying line for white to face. So instead here, if we backtrack, instead of knight takes c6, we're going to look at knight to b3. So this isn't super common at the club level, but it's played in 73% of master games. So it's clearly a more testing move, and we need to know how to combat this because it's what the top players are doing. This is how people would try to kind of refute this without when they decline Dubov's gambit. So after knight to b3, we castle. We're ready to castle, so we just go for it. And white castle, so both sides castle, bring their king to safety, but this is right before, madness ensues and we're ready to just throw our pawns on either side of the board. So first, we bring our bishop into the game. It's important to develop at times like this. We're never really worried about knight d5, at least for the time being, because if they move the knight to d5, that weakens this e4 pawn. So we would be able to take on e4. So usually white tries to play f3 and support that e4 pawn. And now what do we do?
So after f3, we're going to play rook to c8. And from our point of view, our moves have been pretty consistent so far. Look at this setup. We tend to do this same thing almost no matter what white does. King to b1, most common move. And this is where the tricky part occurs. We need to figure out now, how do we attack white's king in the most efficient way possible? And we're going to play knight to e5. So in some of the other lines, our rook was already eyeing this knight on c3. But in this case, we're looking to maybe play knight to c4. And I used to play the mainline dragons from the white side. And I always hated seeing that black knight land on c4. Because once the knight lands on c4, it attacks the queen, it attacks the pawn. And this pawn has a very important job of guarding these dark squares. White's position is about to get blown open if they're not careful. So most common move, h4. They go for their kingside attack. And here we're going to play a strange looking move, knight to h5. What's our idea here?
So yeah, this is a really kind of unique move that Matt and I came up with. And the idea here is since this knight's on e5, we want to go to c4, but this bishop's not doing anything. It's not developed, so it would just take that knight on c4, and we spent a lot of time getting our knight there, whereas this bishop hadn't moved before then. So what we want to do first is we want to put our knight on h5. So we're inviting white to play g4 here. And after a move like g4, we would play knight to g3. We're forking the rook and the bishop. And once the rook moves, not to h3, once the rook moves, then we would take that knight, or sorry, take that bishop and plop our knight onto c4, where we have a really nice attack on that dark squares. The bishop on g7 really comes alive. We're already threatening moves like knight takes b2, removing the defender of c3. A lot of nasty ideas here, but the point is just to kind of take this bishop off the board so our knight can go to c4. So here, we're going to look at if white plays knight to d5. And this knight on d5 is very powerful. So we can't really let it survive there. So we just trade it off. And now queen takes d5. And we just continue with our plan. So we play knight to g3, rook to h3, and we take on f1. He takes back. This is all pretty much forced. And now we play knight to c4. So this is kind of, we saw our plan come to fruition. This is what we talked about. And now the eval is minus 1.2. But practically, I think we have much better chances than that, because here, white only has one move. It makes a lot of sense to play a move like c3, but that immediately kind of worsens their position tremendously, because we have a very simple plan. We're just going to go queen to b6, a5, a4, and this b2 pawn is going to be a serious, serious problem. So c3 really puts them in a really tough spot. So the only move they can play here is bishop to c1. And even that, it keeps it like minus 1.5 or something. Like, it's still very, very good for black. And again, our plan is just to play queen b6, a5, a4, really put the pressure on white's king. And as we'll see, it takes so long for white to attack us. White never really has an attack. Like, there's nothing they can do here. They can push this pawn. Maybe they can take and open up the H file, but like even if they get everything they want, it's going to take a long time for their attack to actually do anything. Whereas we're ready to break through on the queen side right now.
Yeah, and I think the problem for white is that bishop on g5 is stuck playing a defensive role when it goes back to c1, the strongest move. And really, they need to trade these bishops to create their kingside attack. But we're just a little bit faster. What I like about this whole line with the knight f5, knight g3 is there were multiple variations that Justin and I looked at. And they're all about balanced according to the engine. But it's a very tactical position. So we wanted to find something that had more of a logical plan that you guys as viewers can remember. Like, okay, this is the idea. We move the knight to h5. We move it to g3. We trade the c1 bishop. That removes the c1 bishop's defense on c4. Then we play knight c4, right? So then when you get to your games, you can start to recall all of these ideas instead of just, I needed to memorize this crazy Sicilian dragon line that's 16 moves deep or something.
Right. Yeah, it's just about the ideas in the position. And this idea is very straightforward. We just want our knight to get to c4.
Yeah. So now let's go back to move 10. We looked at pawn to f3 here. Let's look at bishop to h6 next. Going for the immediate bishop trade. You guys at home can probably guess what we're going to recommend. Bishop takes h6, drawing the queen out, and queen to b6. When you see this knight on b3, not just for this course, but in general, a good plan is to try to attack the knight with the rook pawn. So that's what we're going to do here. After f3, we play a5. And after h4, so they're trying to go for an attack, g4, h5, we simply play a4, and we're faster. We already have a pawn attacking a knight, so white needs to start playing defense. We haven't had to react to white's attack yet, I think, in this whole chapter. So knight to d2, and now pawn to a3. Are we worried at all about white locking things up, playing pawn to b3?
No, and it's actually very instructive to look at. So we'll go a few moves deeper after b3, because b3 really is the only try. If white tries to take here, their king is just wide open, and the attack is really breaking through. So b3 is really the only try. And Matt and I were looking at this, and we couldn't see how immediately we break through, but it's more of a long-term pressure on the dark square. So here we start with queen c5, so we immediately attack this knight, and he moves back to b1 to protect it. There's a lot of different squares that this knight could try to go to. Like, for example, knight to a4 immediately runs into rook takes a4.
Ooh.
So there's a lot of problems in the position for white. White has to be very careful. So that's why knight to b1 is the move we're looking at. And we just put pressure on the c file. We bring the rook from f8 to c8, and now we're ready to kind of move this knight and play moves like knight takes a2, which would deflect the knight and allow us to play queen takes c2. So we'll see that after g4, we go for this plan. We play knight to b4, and we're threatening knight takes a2. And now white is kind of low on options, so he has to defend this pawn on c2. So what does white do here?
We're going to look at queen to d2 by white. So again, they're taking one of their attacking pieces, retreating it back to defend. And now we play pawn to d5. This is a thematic move, opening up the center because white's king on the c file, it's very close to the d file, right? So this is going to give us access to white's king. After h5, trying to ignore our d pawn, we simply play pawn to d4, and this pressure coming down the c file is simply too much for white. With the d pawn now attacking the knight, there's not much that they can do. We stop the line here in the text, but if h takes g6, for example, you can actually grab the knight. And if they take the h pawn, take back with the knight. So our position is still winning. And there's actually, let's show that line real quick, Justin. We're going to do take, 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 take. Because if something like this happens, I just have to show this mate. Knight takes a2. Checkmate with the king stuck on c1, blocked by our pawn and its own pieces. That's so cool. All right.
Yeah, this pawn on a3 is super strong, and it creates a lot of opportunities like that. So for example, if instead of a takes g6, if white plays queen takes d4, we play knight takes a2 check, and the knight can't take again because we have this tactic. And if king d2, which is the only other move, then we just take a free queen. So a lot of crazy tactics in this line, but a lot of it just stems with this really, really strong pawn on a3 that causes a lot of problems for white.
You know the downside of having some of these attacking lines? I think we're going to need to put a not suitable for work tag on this chapter, and people might not be aware of it going into the course. All right, let's go back to move 7. We looked at queen to d2. We have a lot of move 7s. But in this position, we are now going to switch gears and start looking at the bishop coming out. So let's look at bishop to b5 next. This creates a double attack on the knight. And we're going to play bishop to d7. And this is pretty much forced anytime you see this double attack. It's the best way to defend it. Simply put the bishop here. You break this pin against our king, and we're ready for the recapture. Now in this line, we're going to look at kingside castle by white. So not as aggressive as what we saw in the first 5 lines, but there is still some stuff to figure out because white has more space in the center, and they could still go for this idea. Queen d2, bishop h6, for example. So we have to kind of be ready for white's attack still. Bishop g7. And now we're going to look at the most common move for white, rook to e1. What do we do in this position?
So after rook to e1, we're ready to just take on d4. So it's important to mention, if in this position, white plays queen to d2, this might be, seems like a pretty natural move. We just take on d4, and it's just a tempo up version of, what we're about to see instead, if they do rook to e1. So after rook to e1, we take, queen takes d4, and now this queen is lined up with her bishop, so we're kind of inviting the queen onto that diagonal. And the light squared bishops here are kind of staring at each other. They're going to trade off at some point, so we might as well kick the knight to kind of have an awkward square on b5 where it can be kicked out later, moves like a6 and help us expand. But now we just castle. We got to get our king out of the center. That's always a priority in chess. So we just do that right now. Then white brings their rook in, and we play queen to a5. So this is already setting up another trick. So if you are new to chess or, are just new to tactics in general, undefended pieces are always very, very key. So both of these pieces are undefended. So this is what this tactic is setting up. We're ready, if this knight moves, for example, to take on g5. So this is really a nasty tactic that we're already setting up. And it's very, very tough for white to get out of this. But it's also important to show if a4, a6, it looks like we're kind of ready to, after the knight moves, take on g5. But white does have this resource, bishop d2, to get out of it. Regardless, we are much better, or not much better, minus 0.4 on this position. And we have a solid, it's a solid advantage for black, especially. And we're ready to play rook fc8, a6, bring our queen back to c7 so we can pressure the c file and we just play b5. So we just have a pleasant position. We use that open c file to kind of get some nice play. And black has a pretty comfortable position.
I like it. So now let's back up to move 9. So we looked at rook e1. We talked about queen to d2, transposing to the rook e1 line, but down a move for white. Now let's look at knight takes c6. Pretty much any time white takes on c6, we're already equalizing according to the engine. And we're going to take back with the b pawn here. It's perfectly fine to take back with the bishop, but we recommend this just because it keeps our light bishop on the board, puts that immediate attack on their bishop, so we think it just maybe gives a little more winning chances. Bishop to d3 by white, completing the pawn chain. We play pawn to a5, and our plan is let's run this pawn all the way up to a3. So even though the white king is on g1 and not sitting on c1, having this bishop attack b2 in combination with the a pawn running up the board starts to show our pawn structure advantages, right? So white doesn't have a d pawn. We don't have a b pawn. We can use this b file to pressure the pawn on b2. That's white's weakest pawn in this position. If you look at our position, what's our weakest pawn? We really don't have one. You might argue a5, but we're about to throw this up the board and use it to pressure the pawn on b2. So I really like this kind of strategic queenside play, showing some similarities to our Benko course.
Yeah, it's very strong, and we always want to use this open b file combined with this bishop. This is always a common theme. Anytime they take on c6, the open b file and this bishop on g7 work really well together. So let's continue, and white plays queen to d2. And so the one downside of this queen d2 move is this kind of limits white's retreating moves with this bishop. So we throw in this move h6. And h6 might feel a little weakening, but we're just going to keep chasing this bishop wherever it goes. If it goes to e3, we're ready to go knight to g4. And if it goes to f4, we play g5. We keep going after that bishop. And after bishop to g3, we play knight to h5. And because this position is very open, this bishop on g7 is a beast, especially when we can get rid of its counterpart, white's dark square bishop. So after knight to h5, we have a very, very strong position. Eval is minus 0.8 because, again, this bishop on g7 is just a monster. And combined with our nice pawn structure, we're ready to castle and potentially use this open b file to our advantage. Black just has a really nice position. Another idea, again, is to run this pawn all the way up to a3. So there's a lot of great plans in this position that really give black just a very nice, solid edge. And the two bishops always help in an open position.
Yeah, I think those two bishops are a recurring theme in this course. We look to have the two bishops keep attacking those weak pawns. And we're fine in most of these lines playing to the endgame too. Like queen trade with active bishops and attack on the b2 pawn works pretty well. So now let's look at 7 bishop to c4. We just looked at bishop to b5, bishop c4. We're going to play bishop to g7. And after knight takes c6, we take back with the b pawn. We did have something to note here. If they castle kingside, we castle, knight takes c6. Or did we already look at that? Oh, that's coming up next. Sorry, that's coming up next. Okay, knight takes c6, b takes c6. Now let's look at e5 by white, trying to open up the center. And if we trade queens, we're going to lose castling rights. So this is very tempting for white. And our only good move is actually to take and allow this queen trade. But we're going to show you guys how you get through this. Queen takes d8, king takes d8. We're up a pawn, but our king's a little bit exposed. King to c7. And after bishop takes f7, now we're going to play pawn to e6, trapping in this bishop. And I'm seeing 0.0 according to the engine. But how's your feeling in terms of practical chances here?
I think in terms of practical chances, this is much, much better for black because it's very difficult to get this bishop out, and white really only has one plan to do so kind of successfully. So we're going to look at that. If they take on f6, we have to take back. Then they play knight to e4. So again, this is kind of a weird plan for white, but this is really the only way to save this bishop. We go back to e7 so we can kind of control this knight. And then white plays rook to d3. And so now we see their idea. They're ready to go rook to f3 to support this bishop. But again, all their pieces are kind of tied down. This bishop isn't doing anything. And now this rook is tied down to this bishop. So we've reached a position where it's just kind of a lot easier for black to play because we have pieces that can move. And that kind of helps a lot with our position. So first, we just play rook to b8. We want to continue our development, get all of our pieces into the game. And yeah, now after rook to d1, we play rook to b4. And this sets up a trap. So if this knight on e4 moves, what do we do, Matt?
We're going to play our rook to f4, cutting off the connection of the rook and bishop. And essentially, the bishop now on f7 is trapped. So no matter what white does, we win that bishop and we're going to win the game. And I think that's why this position is so much easier to play for us. You see that bishop trapped on f7. White's got to constantly figure out, how do I defend? How do I defend? And like Justin mentioned, you want to play active in these endgames. And this is chess in general. Whenever you reach an endgame, play active. You want to be the side creating threats, creating problems for your opponent. That's what we have here with great practical chances. So now let's back up a little bit. And we looked at 12 bishop takes f7 in this position. Let's look at rook h to e1. So if they don't, drop the bishop in here, allowing us to kind of trap it for a while, what if they just develop? And I think this is a stronger line by white. This is one of the strongest lines for white in the whole course, in my opinion, because we do still have this king on c7 that we got to figure out in some weak pawns. What we're going to do is we're going to play e6. We're going to play very solid here. And even though the engine is saying it's a small advantage for white, they have to find a critical move in this position. And we're 13 moves deep. They have to find f4 to hold that like half a pawn advantage. And almost everybody here plays rook takes e5, regaining the pawn, but this allows us to comfortably equalize, and I think we still have good winning chances with the pawn imbalances. So what do we do next?
Yeah, here, after we play knight to d5, this kind of resolves any of our pawn structure issues because we have this pressure on c3, so he kind of has to take on d5, and then we're ready to take with the c-pawn, and we have this nice pawn structure and control in the center. So yeah, our position is very comfortable because we have this control in the center. Another important thing is here, white's in a tough position because both the bishop and the rook are under attack. So white has to find this move, bishop to f4, which is also another crazy move because if we take, they would take and win the rook. But anyway, if we go back, Um, our idea is just to go knight to d5, and eval is around equal, but the bishop on g7 is really, really strong. And because they have to find this precise idea of taking and then playing bishop to f4, seemingly sacrificing their rook, it's going to give us a good amount of practical chances. And another plan we can do in the future is later on, we could try to expand in the center. We'll have these pawns on e6 and d5, and we can try to keep pushing them with moves like f6 and then e5. So we want to develop the rest of our pieces, and then in the future, we want to keep expanding that center. So black has a pretty nice position. And as always, when we have this pawn structure, launching this a pawn up the board is always going to be an idea in the position.
I love it. The Alpha Zero rook pawn marching up the board. Okay, so let's go back to 7, bishop c4, bishop g7. We looked at knight takes c6, and I got confused the first time around, but now we're going to look at 8 castling to round out our bishop to c4 lines. We're going to castle. Knight takes c6 by white. And worth noting here, if they play queen to d2, we have the classic Sicilian dragon tactic, knight takes e4, hitting the queen and opening up this double attack on the d4 knight. And even if they take d2, or sorry, c6, you can take d2. This is also going to win a pawn for us. So we're winning a pawn no matter what. So most players will take here, getting rid of that tension on d4, making sure they don't lose a pawn. We take back, queen to d2, getting on this diagonal, probably threatening the bishop moving to h6 soon. Now we play rook b8, claiming this half-open b file. And like we've seen before, in almost any Sicilian structure, if you're to strip most of the pieces off the board and just leave the pawns, the endgame favors black. And it either favors black slightly, or if you have the right pieces on the board, it favors black quite a bit. So we always have the endgame in our back pocket that we can play for the win. And I think here, this is starting to show already why our pawn structure is better than white's.
Yeah, here, that rook on b8 is just very, very strong, and that pawn structure allows us to bring it to this very strong square. So now, white tries to play bishop to b3. So what this does, we wanted to look at a different move. They could do something like b3, but that would weaken their diagonal. So with this bishop c4 line, now they do have this option of playing bishop b3. So we wanted to look at that. And now the thematic idea is to go a5, a4, but white is pretty well prepared for this. So we don't really want to go for that in this position. So we just continue our development. We play bishop to a6. Bishop is pretty happy on this diagonal. We're just unimpeded. It's very, very strong. And then we have an idea after the rook moves, we're ready to go c5 and then c4 and really shut out this bishop on b3. So we've got a lot of play on this queen side. Ready? We have this plan of going c5, c4. We can bring our queen to a5, our rook to c8. I think it's just a very nice position for black because I'm not really sure what white's plan is. I know what we're going to do. We're going to do what we just talked about. I have no idea what white's going to do. So yeah, it's just a very nice position. We're slightly better. It's like minus 0.1. But again, I think practically we're the ones that are creating threats. We're the ones that have a plan. So I think black is going to be much better.
Yeah, I like it. So now let's go back to move 7 for white, and we will look at pawn to f3. Not super common, but we think it's worth covering because it does create this sort of, I don't know, kingside attacking formation, right? You see this quite a bit in the Sicilian. They put the pawn on f3. It can launch g4. So we're going to play bishop g7, queen d2. And anytime you see the queen go to d2, you have to start thinking about the dragon thematic tactic. Do you have knight takes e4? And in this case, the answer is yes. And this is a very common line for white. So we can take, even with the f-pawn guarding. It doesn't matter. Because the problem for white is we have this double attack on d4. So if f takes e, we play bishop takes d4. We're up a pawn, and that king is actually a little bit loose. After knight takes c6, most common move. We're going to take the queen. They take our queen. Now both knights are attacked. We can grab the bishop, and they don't have a bishop for that knight to grab. So they grab a pawn. We take back the king. They take back the knight. We play bishop e6. So when the dust settles, the material is actually equal. But we have the two bishops, and this position has a wide open center. So no pawns are locked up. And we have the half open c file. Put our rook here. Put some pressure on c2. We're going to expand queenside, probably move the b pawn, move the a pawn up the board. What do you think about this position? Do you like black here or white?
I really like black here. And at first, it might not seem like black has that big of an advantage here, but just this wide open set. There's not a single pawn in the center. You almost never see that in chess. So for us to have the two bishops in this kind of position is just very, very deadly. And they're just incredibly strong. Again, this is kind of the theme of the course, is we're going to have the two bishops a lot. So we want to be comfortable with knowing when and how to open up positions. We're going to be comfortable with just having the two bishops and when that's going to give us a nice and solid advantage. So because this position is wide open and we have the two bishops, we have a very, very clear advantage. And the eval is close to -1 already.
Yeah, I'm really loving this chapter. And I actually like the Dubov accepted just as much, which is chapter 2, but we'll get to that later. So now let's look at 7 f4 instead of f3. Very aggressive approach by white. And this tends to overextend white's position a little bit, I think. When you see the pawn coming on f4, makes it a little more difficult for them to play things like h4 and g4 because they don't have that anchor point on f3. Here we're going to play bishop g7. They take, we take. And now in this position, what do we expect white to play? There's kind of a couple moves that we might tend to see.
Yeah, so if they do something like queen f3, which is kind of a common idea in some of these open Sicilians, we just play queen b6. And this is a very strong move because we're targeting this b2 pawn. Let's just show this on the board. And if they were to castle to protect it, we already not only have moves like rook b8 that put pressure on that pawn, but we just have bishop to g4, which immediately pick up an exchange without having to do any real hard work. So queen to b6 puts white in a very uncomfortable situation. So we're going to look at instead if white tries something like e5. So e5 is a little bit more critical. It makes sense to combine this with the move f4 because now this is protected. So after e5, we play this move knight to g4. So knight g4 kind of capitalizes on their weakening pawn moves. They play f4, and now this knight is even stronger on the g4 square because it has access to, say, the e3 square. So now white takes on d6, and this is kind of a crazy, crazy position, but we have to keep the initiative. So how do we keep the initiative in this position?
Queen to b6, threatening checkmate in 1 and threatening the pawn on b2. And Justin threw a statistic in the notes. Fun fact, 8% of people here actually play d takes e7 in the club database, which falls for the mate in 1. That's just amazing. Queen to e2, though, most common move. Threatening a mate of their own. So don't fall for that checkmate. We can simply castle here. And after they take the pawn on e7, we can save our rook. And at this point, white is +2 in terms of material count. But if you look at the engine, it's a -4 or -5. So even though we are down 2 pawns due to our pressure that we have on the dark squares, the king in the middle for white sitting on e1, all of our pieces are pretty active. It's actually like 6 points of compensation for the 2 pawns. Just an insane position in terms of the amount of play that we have.
It's really wild. And again, the center is wide open. That's kind of the key in a lot of these positions, and is why it's really dynamic and double-edged. When the center is wide open, it's going to create a lot of winning chances and a lot of tactics in the position. So right away, this king isn't castled, and that's huge.
Let's show queenside castle. Show that top engine line just as they're sacking the knight in one more move.
Yeah, so we play rook to b8. I mean, we're already threatening a b2. The second best move is to play b3, which just gives up this free free knight on c3. And the best move is to play knight b5, which we just take the knight. So White's in a very, very tricky spot, and already the best way to defend is just give back any sort of material that they can scrounge up. So Black has just a crushing position here, even though we're down 2 pawns again. It's just crazy how much pressure we have in the position.
So now let's look at the last line of the chapter. Move 7, knight takes c6. We're going to take back. Pawn to e5. This is the only way to really differentiate this line from some of the others, is what if they just immediately go for e5. We're going to take. And in this position, we don't have the bishop on g7 yet. So it's actually a better version for us than that other queen trade line we looked at. So queen takes, queenside castle. It's all pretty natural. King c7. And this has the shielding pawn on c6. So he's pretty safe here. And with this bishop on f8, what's the difference in this position versus the other one where our bishop was already committed to g7?
Yeah, it's a very, very slight difference, but it makes kind of a really big, big difference in this position, because after bishop to c4, usually that just kind of wins this pawn, right? But because our bishop is on f8, this bishop is protecting e7, and that allows this knight to move. So we play knight to g4. We threaten this fork on f2, which would win in exchange. So they have to deal with it. Usually they play bishop to f4 to deal with it. And then now we can deal with this deal with this unprotected pawn on f7. Since we moved this knight out of the way, now we are ready to make a move like f6 in the future. But first, we can play knight to h6. So our knight wants to go back to the square anyway, because we're going to play f6 in the future. And now it's ready to head to f5 and kind of kick out this bishop into an uncomfortable square. So after knight to h6, Black is just kind of a healthy pawn up. We're ready to play knight to f5, to f6. Bishop to h6 is a really nice square for the bishop. And then our other bishop is going to a6. So all of our pieces find really nice squares. And even if we weren't a pawn up, I feel like this position would be pretty comfortable for Black to play. So it's a pretty healthy pawn, and I think it's a very nice position for Black.
I like it too. So that rounds out the 13th and final line of the chapter, the Dubov decline chapter. We will see you guys in chapter number 2, where they accept the knight on f6.